Hello, you're listening to Sending the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher and Senko myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining us. In this episode, I am delighted to be joined by Helen Evans and Jilly Davis from the PDA Society. Helen is the Chief Executive of the PDA Society and Jilly is the Education Lead. Hi, how are you both?
Hi. Good, thank you. Hi.
Yeah, lovely to be here today. Thanks for inviting us.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. We'll start straight away, just in case, because there will be people listening who are thinking, what is this episode about? What does PDA stand for? So tell us straight away, what is PDA?
Oh, well, thank you for the chance to explain that. So PDA stands for Pathological Demand Avoidance, and it's widely but not universally understood to be a profile of autism. And it involves the avoidance of everyday demands and the use of social strategies to do this. So autistic children, I think it's always important to begin with this, autistic children with a PDA profile have many strengths. So a strong sense of social justice, being independent, charismatic, creative, compassionate, humorous, imaginative, tenacious, but there are also things they struggle with, which are everyday demands like eating, drinking, getting dressed, just because they're demands. And this can include things that they enjoy, like playing their favourite game. So it's not a deliberate choice. It's a matter of can't, not won't, with demands causing anxiety, triggering a fight, flight, freeze response if they can't be avoided. But pervasive demand avoidance is just one trait, and there are others as well. So PDA children commonly use social strategies to avoid everyday demands like distraction, procrastinating, excusing themselves, withdrawing into role play or fantasy. And they can also appear sociable on the surface, but lack a depth in understanding. So experiencing excessive mood swings, impulsivity. They might have obsessive behaviour focused often on other people, and sometimes not always may appear comfortable in role play and pretend sometimes to an extreme extent. So I think we always think it's important to talk about here the whole profile, because sometimes people might focus on the demand avoidance and miss actually that there's a profile to PDA.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think you're completely right that we need to focus on the whole child in a sense, and some of the positives it may bring as well as some of the challenges they face. I think that's really important. So I get the correct terminology, and I know we discussed this before the podcast as well, but what is the preferred terminology when we're talking about PDA? When I'm referring to a child, what should I say?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because language is so important and so powerful. So, the PDA community is a diverse group of people, and they've got different preferences as to what terminology they prefer. So some people feel that the term pathological demand avoidance is accurate and appropriate, as the demand avoidance they experience is innate and all-consuming. But others reject that pathologising of PDA and prefer to say things like pervasive drive for autonomy, or my son, for example, he likes pretty darn Austin.
I love that.
Yeah, and at the PDA Society, we tend to say autistic with a PDA profile or a PDA person, and that's in keeping with the wider autistic community. So you'd never say a person with autism, just as we wouldn't say a person with PDA. And I think any, people listening to this, I'd say it's so personal, and I'd encourage everyone to ask their learner, what terminology do they prefer, to begin that conversation and then to use that terminology for them.
That's a really good point, actually. I'm thinking everyone is unique, aren't they? So thinking about what they would prefer as a person is a really nice, in that way, and finding out their preferred terminology. Yeah,
have that conversation with them, give that opportunity for them to say what works for them.
So can you tell us a bit about your backgrounds, both of you, so Jilly and Helen? Why did you decide to work for the PDA Society? Do you have personal interest? Is this something tell me, where does it come from?
Shall I go first, Jilly, and then I'll hand over to you?
Helen, go for it.
Yeah, so I'm autistic, and my son is autistic with a PDA profile. Yeah. And my son was first diagnosed as autistic and ADHD, and I did everything I thought was the right thing to do. So I got loads of, great sort of visual diaries and focused on structure and routine, and he hated it, and he was really struggling, and every day was telling me that through distressed behaviour. And a year later, I had a clinician say to me, I think your son has a PDA profile. And I wasn't familiar with that. I went away and did what everyone did, Googled, found the PDA Society, and it gave me that, I describe it like a key to unlocking that understanding about my son and really individualising the approaches I was taking to support him as an autistic person, which are different to mine. And it just transformed how we are with each other and our own understanding. And he now doesn't express himself through distressed behaviour daily. Things would come on so much. And as a result, when an opportunity came up at the PDA Society, I just thought, wow, how fabulous to work for an organisation that's helped me and my son so much. So I joined summer last year. So that's
really. I was just going to say, though, that must have been really hard. Being autistic yourself, I bet you thought, I'm autistic, I'm going to know how to support my son if he's autistic as well. It must have been quite an eye-opener for you, realising that there was something different, that must have been
Oh gosh, so for me, a good holiday is one which has a spreadsheet, and I literally do this with colour coding for the different themes we're going to have throughout the day.
Oh, I love this.
Yeah, normally sort of it's like, have an hour and then sort of little slots in between. My son, that would drive him crazy. He'd be like, the extent to which I'm taking away that, he's much more in the moment. He needs things to be much more sort of responsive and reactive to what's going on. He needs things to be much more indirect. I like things to be direct. I like things to be very ordered and structured and planned. I like to know ages in advance. If I do that with my son, it doesn't work at all. It's been a real learning journey for us both. And I'm still learning, and I'm learning so much from him, as much as the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. Jilly, then, what's your background then? Why are you interested in PDA?
Yes, okay. So I've worked specifically with PDA learners for about 18 years. That was within a school run by the National Autistic Society. Yeah. We first came across PDA, I suppose, back in 2004. Where we had a few children, we were really struggling to engage them in learning. We thought we had enough knowledge supporting our autistic learners, that those traditional autism good practice that we know so well. But this approach just seemed to cause them just more stress and anxiety. And one of those children actually had a PDA diagnosis at that time, and the others didn't fit. And then the other children we had sort of fitted that PDA profile as much as we knew. Yeah. And I have to say, those kids taught me so much. And actually, all the children I've worked with is where I've sort of got my knowledge from. Yeah. But back then, when I researched how best to support these young people, I came across the PDA Society. Thank goodness. And even then, the resources and the advice on their website was invaluable to me as a teacher and to the school as a whole. So during those years of working, I then met some of the trustees at various conferences, and I retired from school life 3 years ago, contacted the society, offered to be a volunteer, which they accepted. I'm now a trustee and education advisor. Brilliant. For them. So I think for me, if I can share what I've learned with other teaching professionals, regarding ideas and suggestions, because often their toolkit is pretty much empty, as to what to do with these young people. And so how best to support them, then hopefully these youngsters will have a much happier and a safer time in school, and maybe be able to reach that full potential, whatever that may look like.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's great that you've got such a diverse group of people in the PDA Society as well. Like you've got, like yourself, Helen, who you've got experience from a personal point of view with your son and being autistic yourself. And then you've got people like Jilly who have got the experience of teaching children with a PDA profile. That's really good. I like it. So Jilly, then, can you tell me how might a PDA learner present in a classroom then? Because there will be teachers listening thinking, okay, is there somebody in my classroom then? Am I not aware of them? I know personally, and I know I said this at the start of the podcast before we started recording, I'm 10 years ago, I was teaching a girl, and I won't give her too much information because it's not my story to tell, but looking back after having done quite a lot of research recently about PDA, looking back, she was she was definitely autistic, and I'm pretty certain she had a PDA profile. And I feel like I let her down, if I'm honest. Like, I felt quite upset when I was reading about PDA, and I thought, oh gosh, that was her. And I didn't have the toolkit, I didn't have the knowledge, it wasn't even I didn't know about PDA at all at that point. And yeah, I feel like she was let down, and it's quite upsetting, really. So this doesn't happen. How might PDA learners present in the classroom?
Yeah, so Georgina, I have to say I was the same as you in terms of, I feel when I was learning, I did actually let, perhaps some kids down because I was trying to fit them into our box at school, and that wasn't going to work. But just let me tell you about the first child I met.
Yes, please do.
He came in smiling, he was cheeky, he was funny, he was articulate, he was bright. But very quickly, I was very wrong-footed by his ability to charm, to manipulate, and excuse me for using that word, but that's what it felt like to me at the time, and how confident he was about taking the lead in class. And when he refused, he was very calmly refusing to do anything I asked him to, and he was very confident in that. So what did I do as a teacher? I used those positive approaches. I used rewards, visuals, incentives, positive praise, those special interests to engage. That didn't work. So then as a teacher, I thought, right, okay, consequences, warnings, talks with the family, stricter, firmer boundaries. And the result was just volcanic. It just didn't work. I was called all the names under the sun. He was abusive to the other children then. He became quite cruel and unkind, and actually took over the role of teacher. So I knew everything was very wrong in what I was doing. But then I've also had kids who've come in kicking, screaming, that sort of extrovert behaviour, but also young people who are internalizing their anxiety, perhaps, due to maybe masking. So all these kids are unique, and really, actually, there's no clearly defined way in which PDA, I don't know if people want to hear that.
It makes it more difficult, doesn't it?
In which PDA learners would present in the classroom, but some key points is they may not present in a way that might make you suspect autism, if they haven't got the diagnosis. So I think when considering the child as a learner, it is important to remember that not all the key characteristics that Helen mentioned are present in every PDA child, and that children can be affected to a greater or a lesser degree. So that degree of support that a child may need will vary. But we also have to take in other factors such as their personality, their intelligence, their interests, any sort of co-occurring conditions. And certainly in education settings, any previous educational history, which can well have a really disruptive experience for them, which just makes them very untrusting of the school system and of staff until they can build that trust. So I think that's one point. I think what's also confusing is that often a learner's demand avoidance can vary at different times with different people and at different stages in their lives. But I think it's almost always the case, though, that their demand avoidance will cause them to function just below their potential for a lot of the time. So how else can I say? One of the first things is that they can present very differently at school compared to home, perhaps due to masking, which then leads to misunderstandings between home and school. We hear that a lot.
Yes, that's sort of, they're doing fine in school, you don't need to worry. And then the parents are like, but at home we're having real difficulty. Then they blame themselves. We spoke to Kathy from the Autistic Girls Network on the podcast a few months ago, and she said a similar thing about masking with autistic girls in particular, and that sort of being in school, seeming to be absolutely fine, and then they're not fine at all. It's just that they're masking and they're hiding it at school, either consciously or subconsciously.
Absolutely. And parents, not being believed and sent on parenting courses, which don't do any good at all. So I think you'll see a learner that's got a very, very spiky profile, both cognitively, socially and emotionally. But that ability to complete a task is often sort of far more than just their academic ability. So it could be they're very anxious, even more anxious at that time. It could be just the time of the day, any distraction that may be happening. They may be tired. And actually just the presentation of a task could all have a huge impact on helping that young person engage. I think generally speaking, they've got really poor self-esteem, maybe because of their disruptive education, but they do lack that self-esteem, and they do find that emotional regulation really difficult. They're not going to be kids who'll cope with structured lessons on emotions because they really can't understand how they're feeling or what's happening. They're kids who are quite ambivalent about success. They're not bothered if they achieve or not sometimes. I've noticed that with some of our young people. They want friendships, they really, really do, but that can often be sabotaged because of that need for control. Yeah. So that they've got really quite a poor understanding how to navigate that social pathway and those interactions, which, are so tough in school settings. Yeah. You might see a child who will engage extensively in fantasy, pretend, and role play. And often that is quite blurred sometimes between reality and fantasy. Okay. Helen mentioned that they use a range of social strategies to as part of avoidance. This isn't just saying a defiant no. You know, they are masters at using that social language. And as I said earlier, with the first boy I met, they can appear to have those good language skills, but social use of language, it lacks that depth of understanding, I think.
Yeah, wow. It's quite complex, isn't it?
Yeah, I think these, and say they won't present in all the children that we come across, but these are certainly key features that I've sort of found. I think where they struggle again is they lack a sense of social responsibility. So the rules apply to others, but not to them. Okay. And that gets them, can get them, in great difficulty in schools. So they may not confer any automatic respect based on someone's age or someone's position in hierarchy, such as, the teacher or the head teacher. So I think often they see themselves as equal to adults. Right. So that makes sense why a lot of the conflict can happen. And if they're seeing themselves as an equal with an adult, I'd feel a bit funny if an adult was bossing me about, one of my equals at work was then starting to tell me stuff to do all the time. Yes, we had a little boy, a 9-year-old boy, who dictated how we sat on a chair, where we put our feet, where a position of our hands. And, when you think about it, does that really matter? If that helps him, reduces anxiety and helps him to learn, so what? Does it really matter?
No, absolutely. You've got to think about what the goal of the goal of the lesson is and their learning at school. Yeah. And I think obviously the difficulties with attendance, this is key. Yes. Key as well. Which makes sense on the back of all the other things. So if a parent or a teacher listening to this thinks they've got a child in their care or their child that they parent is presenting with a PDA profile, how can they go about getting them diagnosed, and is it a good idea to get diagnosed? I presume it is.
It's a really important question. So as I was saying before, our understanding at the PDA Society is that PDA is a profile of autism. So the starting point would be seeking an assessment for autism, and that can depend on the age of the child, whether that takes place within a paediatric setting if they're younger, or if they're a little older within a CAM setting, which stands for Child, Adolescent and Mental Health Services. The reality is, though, it is really hard right now in the UK to get an assessment, and we know a lot of parents can be waiting a year, more than a year. In some cases, we're hearing 3 years plus.
That's what I'm hearing too. It's not good, is it?
And that's incredibly tough, because then parents are facing a choice about, do you wait? Or do you use personal funds to pay for a private assessment? And then that creates a two-tier system between those who can afford an assessment and those who can't. So that is unfortunately where we are at the moment. And then if you get an autism assessment, the question is, will they identify a PDA profile? And it's a real postcode lottery across the UK at the moment.
This is what I've heard. I've heard personally people I know who've said, they've tried to, they've got local authorities that just aren't even recognising it as a profile.
We talked before there about, PDA, relatively speaking, being a newish term. And And so you have some authorities who really recognise it and think this is so important in terms of that personalisation of identifying someone's needs and getting the right approaches, and others who say it's not in the diagnostic manuals, it's not in nice guidance. So even though we can use that clarifying language, they choose not to. On the PDA Society website, we do have listed independent centres that you can approach who we know identify and assess for PDA.
Right.
Something we've done at the PDA Society, though, is because we feel really strongly it shouldn't be a postcode lottery. It shouldn't be down to your financial circumstances.
No, not at all.
Yeah, we published a practice guidance for identifying and assessing a PDA profile, and we sent that out to every single centre in the UK that undertakes neurodevelopmental assessments. So Brilliant. Every centre should have that now. And if someone is going through an assessment process and they're saying, well, we don't know about PDA, you can go onto our PDA Society website, you can look that practice guidance up, you can print it off and you can give it to them. And Brilliant. That takes them through step by step, what to look for, what criterion to assess against, because we really want to help tackle that postcode lottery. We want everyone to be able to go for an assessment and to say, could you consider a PDA profile as well?
Yeah, definitely. Because like you say, it's completely unfair if you've got somebody in one county that they're saying it could be, and then in another county, they're not even going to consider it. It's just not fair on the child, is it? And that, the whole reason is we need to be supporting the children with it. So why is there this controversy surrounding PDA then? Because there is controversy. I'm not wrong in saying that. There is, what is the controversy? Do we?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of that is to do with research. So there is some really, good research out there about PDA. However, in terms of, the years that we've got that research, if you compare it against autism or other types of conditions, it's still relatively young. And we agree more research is needed. But because of where we're at with the research, PDA isn't recognised within the diagnostic manuals. So that's currently ICD 10 or 11 or DSM 5, and it's not within NICE guidance. So some authorities are saying, well, look, it's not there. So, how can we identify it? But what we say is, there is research there. It's not like there's none, there is. And there's also a huge amount of lived experience of people who were PDA children who are now adults saying, I'm living and breathing this. And from teachers, we run training courses. The majority of people asking for our training are teachers, because teachers are there saying, we see this as well. Just as Jilly is saying here, she say, you get those learners, you think this isn't fitting the typical profile. So with that huge body of lived experience, we would hope that local authorities would be, recognising that. But because of where we're at with the research, there is then that controversy. And there's also, I think it's important to acknowledge some people within the autistic community who say, is this a backward step? We've moved away from different terms like Asperger's to autism spectrum condition, or just saying autism.
Yeah, of course.
And there are some people who are a bit worried about identifying a PDA profile being a step back. For me personally, and I say this as an autistic person, I see it as a real positive, because I have that experience of, because people say, you should look at personalisation. You shouldn't need to have a PDA profile identified to do that. I read all the books. I was attending all of the courses to support my son, and I didn't get it until someone said to me, I think he's got a PDA profile. And that for me is just my personal experience of why that was so important. And, why I think we really do need to have that PDA profile identified.
No, that makes complete sense. Absolutely. And one of the books I've been reading was The Teacher's Introduction to PDA by Claire Truman, which I'll give a bit of a shout out because I think it's a really excellent book. And one of the things she said to her was that she said that a colleague used to say to her, the researchers don't know if PDA exists, but the children certainly do. And that sort of stuck with me, because it's like you're saying, no matter if people disagree with the research, there are people with lived experience of this. There are children who have this. Like, it's not, you can't say it's not there if there are children who are experiencing it. And that's really stuck to me. So why do you think it's important that PDA is recognised then?
I think Helen's covered this a little bit, but the primary reason for identifying that PDA profile are to help those living with PDA and working with them. to help make sense of this, quite a complex presentation that is otherwise, I think, quite difficult to explain. And then to signpost the differentiated approaches. So moving away from the more traditional based, autism strategies that usually recommended, as your learners will know, speakers will know, routine, structure, rewards, consequences, and really based more on a very indirect, low arousal style that allows more negotiation and collaboration.
Yeah, and a bit of flexibility, I suppose.
That flexibility, So I think in schools, staff may have realised that though their learner may have an autism diagnosis, the child's needs are very different to the other autistic pupils, and none of the approaches work, as I found out. So they don't know, they're just empty of what ideas of what to do. So just being aware that, they've got a child in their class that may fit the autism profile does give them ideas and strategies to try and understand that child better and work out those barriers to learning. So I think if we can as teachers keep focused on needs-based support as opposed to labeling and diagnosing, and not get caught too much up in the label, because we do feel actually the PDA-friendly approaches will work for a lot of young people, especially with that sort of anxiety. And if it's okay, I'll just give you a quote from one of my students
please do.
Who said, look, most youngsters with PDA are eager to learn. I think it's important that schools and teachers know that, because my teachers did not understand my condition at all. And quite often they thought I was deliberately trying not to learn. They gave me whatever work I'd missed as homework, as they thought it would stop me from zoning out again in school. But obviously it didn't help. This is just one example where I felt I was punished and made to feel naughty just for being PDA.
Wow.
So, that's sort of powerful message there. This young girl is now, well, she's 17 now, but so it's not that long, long ago. So I think we have to acknowledge their learning differences. We have to change the way we teach, working collaboratively, flexibly. And I think our role is much more a guiding and exploring role with the young person. So that child-led approach, that giving that freedom when you can.
Sort of more like a facilitator of learning in a sense.
A mentor facilitator. Skilled at negotiating, I think is another skill that is helpful.
It's very interesting. And sort of PDA doesn't just affect education either, does it? I think it's important to, it doesn't just stop at school. It affects everyday life. I was watching one of your videos, and again, I'll direct people to watch them. You've got some brilliant videos on the PDA Society website, and one of them was demand avoidance of the PDA kind. And there was a woman on there, and she was saying that when her stomach rumbles, she feels like that's a demand in itself. That's, again, another thing that stuck with me, because I had no idea that would be felt as a demand for her. So, are there any other ways that lives are affected by PDA that aren't education based? Like, what else is affected?
Oh, it's such an important question, because there's kind of, everybody experiences some form of demand avoidance, but what we're describing here about PDA is that pathological demand avoidance. So it's all encompassing. It doesn't just happen in the classroom, it happens in every aspect of your life. So that quote was talking about that internal demand, and my son's had that with drinking, where the demand of me saying, could you have a glass of water, it's a really hot day, before I knew about his PDA was too much. And then he didn't drink. And I thought,
goodness, as a parent, that is terrifying, isn't it?
And so I was like, right, okay, I thought, so, my view was autistic brain was right to knowledge. He doesn't realise how serious this is. So what did I do? Call up the doctor and say, can we have an appointment? And you can explain to him why it's so important he drinks. So then my poor son has the demand now of having to go to the doctors, having to listen to the doctor explain to him. And did that help? Absolutely not. And I'm at my wit's ends then, because he's not drinking enough. It becomes a huge issue. And we just I just was trying everything. And the thing that worked was I stopped talking about it. And I still have today a table where we never talk about the need to drink, but on that table is always, in his favourite cup, water. And it's just out of sight, there's no pressure. And now he does regularly drink. And it was just me having said, because it was getting hot and me putting the pressure on him and the demand of drinking, that meant that was too much. So there's lots of different types of demands there. There's the kind of direct demands, like asking someone to do something, but then there's the indirect demands, like praise. Actually, that can be a demand in itself.
I read this, and again, another thing I had no idea, and I found this fascinating, that praise can be a demand in itself. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, so it's basically then you've got that anxiety about that future expectation, because it's almost like so you've done it well, congratulations, and the unsaid is, and we expect you to do it well again. So it's, that can then be hard to understand, can't it? Because you think, oh, surely that should be a positive thing. And, there can be then demands within demands. So like the demand of going to the cinema, which you might really want to do, but you have to stay seated. And that knowledge of, I've got to sit here through the whole of this, even though I really want to watch that film.
Yeah, it's like the social rules, in a sense, the social demands that are placed on us in those sorts of situations that you don't really think about, do you? But there are, Yeah,
and then the things you sort of feel you ought to do, like, all right, I've got to get up, I've got to get dressed. If you break it down, that is a lot of demands in itself. So for example, in a day for my son, we're constantly looking at how can I really reduce those. So, it's, and as Jilly said, sometimes it's like just letting things go. Like last night, my son was, we talk about spoons, sometimes his spoons were full and he wasn't able to have a shower. And I could have then gone, right, you've got to have a shower, you need to have that each day. But what we now do is I recognise I take it, across a few days or a week, and I think, how important is that really right now? And actually what's more important is the fact that he's tired and he needs to, if we're going to do this, it's just going to be too much for him and really triggering. So I let it go. And it's having that flexibility is just so important to be supportive of your PDA children or your PDA learners.
Can I ask, and I didn't put this in the questions that we discussed, but I'm just thinking, like, what do you do if there's something that is non-negotiable, like a demand that you need your child to do? What would you do in those circumstances? Because obviously you can let the shower go once every so often, it doesn't really matter. But what if it's like really, really important, like safety wise? Or
absolutely. So I have that with my son, and I think there's a lot of people who think, all right, so what's been advocated here is no boundaries, and that's absolutely not it, or no demands. It's not at all. I have conversations with my son about, what are things about safety, but I explain why. And as Jilly said, we find a lot of our PDA children don't see hierarchy. And if you talk to them like a child, that can be really annoying. But if you talk to them like an adult, so for example, running outside the front door and straight into a busy road, we have conversations about that. And then it's about the framing. So using the approaches that support PDA learners around using indirect language rather than direct language, looking at the framing. So a lot of PDA learners respond quite well to taking a step back and saying, for example, this is a rule that someone else has imposed. I'm not here putting that demand on you. It's just something, that we have to adhere to for that reason. Jilly, what would you add to that?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree. So sometimes it's very, obviously in school there's some non-negotiables, but it's again working with the young person. So for example, one of the first boys I worked with, he decided he was going to be a car and change from being a boy to a car. This going into this fantasy world, because it's a safe place to be. He can be in control. He can dictate what a car can do. So we had to go along with that in terms of if he wanted to go to PE, it was about changing his tyres for the right activity. If he had a flat tyre, we had to pretend to pump it up, sort of thing, really. And then he'd give excuses as to why he couldn't do something, because cars don't have hands, type of thing, really. So it's sort of going with that. But when it came to non-negotiable, he would run around school at 90 miles an hour, crashing through the doors, knocking kids over, and blame the car that it was a crash, or the person in front was a car that didn't put the brakes on properly or didn't indicate. So it was about negotiating with him. So that's an absolute non-negotiable. That couldn't happen, basically. No. But and he wasn't prepared to listen to our side of the story or the other kid's side of the story. But actually, in this instance, going into his fantasy role play world, I set up speed limits all around school. So through the corridors, it was 10 miles an hour, and we paced up what 10 miles an hour looked like to being 70 miles an hour out in the playground when there were no kids around.
Yeah.
And from that day, he followed that. So, they need to have a reason, if they haven't got, that's just one example, but they need a reason for a rule, not just because we told you so.
Yes.
So I would write code of conducts that have come from somebody else, maybe a health and safety officer, or about a certain thing in school as to why something couldn't happen. I'll use social narratives. I know lots of your listeners might be using social stories, but we find they're a bit too prescriptive for our PDA learners and too direct. So I would often use a social narrative. Maybe they've got a footballer they're keen on or somebody in a group. And I'd say, well, this guy, when they're feeling, whatever the kid uses, angry or frustrated, this is what they do. I wonder if you fancy doing that. It's an option, an option for you to try. So suggest, is this a better way to deal with how you're feeling than those non-negotiables of hitting, damaging property?
A lot of those things are similar to how you would talk to another adult. It just strikes me, I just think, where you say, if my husband said to me, right, Georgina, empty the dishwasher now, I'd be like, what? We'd have a full-on argument over it. I would not want to do it if he said it like that to me. But if he was like, oh yeah, I've got a lot on it, oh, I think the dishwasher needs emptying, blah blah blah, and just did it in that sort of way, I'd be more likely to do it. And it's a similar sort. Is it a similar sort of thing? It's a similar sort of way around it, isn't it? Or if I was told, we need to do this because so and so has said we need to do it, or I'd be more likely to want to do it than if he told me direct. Maybe it's just me.
No, that's the point. And I think, that we have to accept there are some days when that non-negotiable is you don't hurt yourself, you don't hurt me, you don't damage property. And then you have to, sort of minimise those ground rules depending on the anxiety at, any given time, really.
Yeah. So I noticed on your website there was a mnemonic for strategies, which was PANDA, PANDA. I can't spell panda. What are these strategies? Could you tell people about these, please?
Okay, well, this was devised, which is a fantastic resource, and I really recommend anybody goes onto our website. And I don't know if we're sending links out to.
I will make sure there are links.
Sources.
I will make sure there are.
I recommend every school downloads it. It's free, and they have it up in their staff rooms, etc. Especially if they've if they've done a training course and it's like a refresher. But it's really just a simple reminder of helpful approaches and the strong need that we need to tailor the environment and our teaching to meet, these learners' needs. So the overall message within the mnemonic is to see the person, explore their interests, and really engage positively. So breaking that down, we use the terminology PANDA because it's like PDA learners, pandas need the right environment to strive, and without that right environment, they'll struggle. So in terms of the P, this is really about picking your battles all the time, days to minimise rules, and picking your demands, really.
Yeah.
Depending on their tolerance at any sort of given time. It's about allowing that choice and control. So, bringing that in. As we just mentioned, explaining a reason and a purpose for something that's got to happen, whether it's a lesson or whether it's something that they've asked for.
Yeah.
And those days, as Helen said, where there are days where they can't help, won't.
Yeah.
And they need to be accepted that sometimes something's not going to happen, but it's going back to those ground rules. Keep yourself safe, keep other people safe, don't damage property. So sort of the A is around anxiety management.
Yeah.
What works best, we definitely know, is a very low arousal approach to reduce that uncertainty and the stress levels. It's about proactively recognising their build-up of avoidance, which is often displayed within a hierarchy of avoidance strategies. So they'll start at a certain level. Maybe they may appear quite calm and able, but very quickly they'll start distracting us, which they're skilled at. They might make excuses, and then they may sort of move on to fantasy world to incapacitating themselves. Then they move up to that non-compliance or what appears to be complete compliance. And then they've reached the panic attack because the demands haven't been reduced. So it's identifying and knowing their hierarchy avoidance strategies to reduce that anxiety, which is so useful.
So then you stop them getting to that stage where the fight and flight and they can't cope, because that must be exhausting for children. It's not fair for anyone to go through that, is it?
Absolutely. And recognising that fight, flight, freeze, that distress behaviour is a panic attack. So then it's much more about empathy and support. It's coming from a nurturing approach rather than coming from a sanctions and a behavioural outcome.
Gosh, because imagine if you told somebody off at that point. That's awful, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Quite upsetting thinking about a child getting to that stage. And if you're thinking it is a panic attack, telling a child off who's having a panic attack, goodness.
Hopefully it makes people think, that it's rooted in anxiety. So, if you lost your car keys or going for a job interview and you were suddenly shouted at or told off for that, then your anxiety would rise very quickly, wouldn't it? So
absolutely.
That's how we sort of break down the A. And then we talk about the N as being, as we've referred to, that negotiation and collaboration is key, where we proactively help work with them as an equal to solve those challenges that they're facing, and that at the heart of it is a fairness and a trust, essential. And then obviously the D is all around disguising and managing demands. So it's about phrasing requests indirectly. It's about monitoring a child's tolerance for demands accordingly, and reduce if necessary. So it's really about knowing the young person well, and often about doing things together to share that demand will all reduce anxiety. And the other skills is that adaptation. Is really those PDA friendly approaches. It's about, I think a lot of these kids have a great sense of humour.
Yeah.
So bring humour into your teaching style. Distraction. Yeah, they can distract, but we're pretty. We can keep up with that. We can use distraction as well, just to reduce that anxiety. Novelty. All the things actually you may not use with your other autistic learners. They can cope with novelty. That role play, spontaneity.
Yeah.
So adapting to their, how they learn best. We've talked about the flexibility. I think as teachers, we always need a plan B and a plan C and a plan D. And that's probably true as parents as well. And to avoid the, I'm the boss scenario is what we're sort of saying. So that's in a nutshell, roughly what the PANDA.
That's a really useful mnemonic, isn't it? It's really helpful.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So in terms of phrasing demands, so we spoke a little bit about that. Have you got any advice on ways to sort of phrase the demands so they're easier for learners with PDA profile? I'm not saying so we can manipulate or we can get our own way. I'm just saying so that we can make it easier. Like if I was in a class and I wanted a child to do a certain piece of work, what would be a good way of phrasing that demand to get them to want to do it so that they could learn effectively?
Yes, you're right, Jean. We're not trying to trick a child.
No.
We're just trying to reduce some of those unnecessary demands to best support. And I think for me, language is key to supporting our PDA learners. And I think if we can come from the angle that PDA demand avoidance is often the request and not the task.
Right.
That's the problem. So how we start discussions can make a huge difference to their engagement. So it is about inviting them to learn, making those casual suggestions, and being using quite subtle adaptations to both our language and our tone can really benefit them. So we recommend using declarative language. So like a commentary.
Yeah.
Works really well, making those statements, even rephrasing things to talk about an object rather than the person works well. Yeah. Simple things like starting and ending with requests with a please, starting with a please. One of our adult PDAs says that helps her enormously. So some examples would be, a typical routine in school might be telling children to get in line.
Yeah.
And an alternative would be, oh, I notice it's time for lunch.
Yes.
So they're joining up the dots, basically. Put your coat on. I wonder what the weather is like today.
Yeah.
Turn to page 12. You might rephrase it as, oh, the information we want is on page 12.
Yeah.
So they are kids actually also can cope with quite complex language. So you can sort of soften the demand by putting it into quite a complicated sentence. So an example might be, oh, I can see the class are clearing up. It must be nearly time for assembly. Shall I help you to finish up? So you're sharing the demand.
Yes.
Do you want to leave them out? Or should we put it all back in the tray? So that's where that choice comes in. So you're in control, but you've given the young person that choice.
Yeah.
So it is turning, I wonder how, I wonder what the best way is, rather than I want you to. So I wonder if anyone knows the answers to these questions. I'm thinking we might need some paints.
Yeah.
I could really use some help carrying these bags, sort of thing, really. So again, there's a really good link on our website. I think also it's important to mention that language to avoid.
Okay, yeah, definitely. I think people will be very keen to hear that.
So starting with a no is just a massive trigger.
Okay.
For a demand avoidant child. But this isn't about giving in. This is just us questioning, why are we saying no? And then if there is a no, maybe we need to give a reason for that. But it's like we learn to say no in a yes way. Yes, we can, but first we need to.
Yeah.
That's a great idea for another time.
Yes.
So you can see, how you can just...
Yeah, like we're going to do it after we've done this. Or not saying no. Yeah, because a lot of the time we're not actually saying no, are we? We're just saying, let's do it later, or we'll do it after this.
Yes, we can, but first we need to.
Yeah,
so that positive start does definitely help. And I would say actually at this stage, also alongside that PDA-friendly language, ask the question to yourself, actually, does this demand need to be given at all?
Yeah.
Do we have, think of all those hidden, Helen talked about demands within demands. How many of those hidden demands can be reduced? Do we have to tell them to line up when they hear the bell? Do we have to tell them to sit at their desks, to get their pens out, to write their name and date at the top of the page? So within the phraseology, just step back, think about what is essential. And that picking the battles, that's where you prioritise demands and remove some of those unnecessary demands.
Yeah. Because I'm just thinking about it from like my own children that have special educational needs, but I'm just thinking about the morning I've just had before the podcast. I've done the school run, and I'm just thinking the amount of demands I've put on both my children to get out the front door. And I'm sure parents listening across the country will be well aware of these demands as well. But they've had to, within 45 minutes, they've had to brush their teeth, they've had to eat their breakfast up, they've had to have a drink, they've had to put the bag on, they've had to get dressed. As a whole, they have been demanded upon a lot before they've got to school. And as teachers, I suppose we've got to think that our learners, when they arrive, they've had all of these demands already, since they've woken up, and then we're adding extra ones. So of course we need to be thinking, are all of these demands necessary? Can we phrase some of them as not demands and not actually put all of these demands on children, because there are a lot, aren't they, in one day?
Absolutely.
So you mentioned it slightly earlier. Am I right in thinking that reward charts and behaviour systems, they don't work for children with a PDA profile? Is that correct?
The quick short answer is they don't work, but it's good to understand why they don't necessarily work. And again, I'm going to give you a comment from one of my students who says that behaviour-based school systems. This was all my school would use, and it just does not work for a youngster with PDA. They just worsens their anxiety, and therefore makes them more likely to be seen as sort of misbehaving at school. So that's come direct from a PDA learner. Gosh. So it's really difficult. Helen touched on it a little bit, both rewards and praise. by saying well done implies that you had an agenda, which they, if you like, fell for.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? I hadn't thought of that either. It really does, because if you say, oh, well done, it's like, oh, I did it, and I didn't. If that demand was something they were finding it difficult to do, then you were saying you've done it. Yeah, that's a really good point.
As Helen said, it creates pressure to do the same the next time in order to please. And actually, a couple of my kids said praise seems to come across to them as quite patronising.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And PDA learners are very sensitive, I found anyway, in my experience, to being patronised.
I suppose if they're seeing themselves as an equal as well, again, thinking of my husband with the dishwasher, if I then did the dishwasher, I've got the dishwasher to do over there, this is why it's on my mind, but if I then did the dishwasher after he asked me to do it and he went, oh, brilliant work, Georgina, well done, great work, you're doing a really good job at being a wife today, I'd be fuming. And I suppose that might be similar for a learner with a PDA profile. Yeah,
Georgina, that's a perfect example. That's like words from this PDA student. I asked that question too. And rewards can be similarly problematic, adding to the already pressurised demand. And, they don't see adults getting stickers or...
No, again, if my husband gave me a sticker for the dishwasher. Yeah. I think that actually the main point is it doesn't address the underlying difficulties, which may be preventing them, the thing from being achieved. So in training, we talk a lot about, the iceberg theory, where we see 10% above the surface, but what lies underneath that 90%, it's really important. So always for teachers to look underneath the behaviour and ask ourselves, question our own values, our beliefs, and just say, actually, what does this child need and how can I meet that need? Yeah, like you should do with all children, I suppose, as well, isn't it? It's thinking about the child.
It is really. I will say, because some of your listeners may be saying, oh, I've got, PDA learner rewards work well. They may work initially because it was a novelty. They like novelty. Yeah. It may work because they were less anxious at that time. But I think over a sort of a long term, the reward systems that are used in schools, they find it very difficult, highly likely that they're going to sacrifice the reward because the anxiety to comply was just too great at a time.
Yeah.
At that time. So for me, it was all about positive reinforcement. It was all about acknowledging and describing good choices, but the effort and the attitude to getting to the point, as they went along. Often I think we resort to direction and correction, don't we? And we forget about that positive behaviour, which often can get missed. So actually, but also I think we have to mention, for some that can be too much even.
Right.
Even sort of praising their attitude and their effect. It might have to be more indirect. So maybe you tell another person about what the child has done well.
Yeah.
And the child overhears it. Sometimes just a smile or a high five can work well. Yeah. And I think if we can acknowledge the times to help them feel proud rather than praise, that will build up that self-esteem and support them more in their learning. Yeah,
that sort of intrinsic feeling good about themselves for doing something rather than just because they've made someone else happy because they've done it.
I think, yes, Georgina, I think that's...
Yeah. But now, when we shared the PDA resources on Twinkle recently, we had loads of interest from the home education community. Is this common? Are many learners with PDA profiles home educated, and if so, why do we think this is? I think people might have gathered why this might be from the discussion, but I think it's important to discuss.
Yeah, no, it's such an important question. So we published a report in 2018 called Being Misunderstood, and we spoke to nearly 1,500 people from the PDA community. So that included parents, PDA adults, professionals. And at that time, 6% of parents to PDA children were telling us that they were electively home educating. We then had 70% of parents telling us, so that this is like, then we're looking at potentially 7 in 10 of the PDA learners are either electively home educated or home educated for other reasons. So that could be a child has been excluded, they're unable to secure a place in a school that meets their child needs, or they were struggling all the time or regularly to get their children in school. So there are a lot of PDA children who have been home educated, but it is a mix of both elective home education and other reasons at all. And I mean, I think, as you said, as we've been chatting through, is probably some of the reasons why, children can thrive at home, have become clear. And, we find when we look at PDA learners, there are PDA children in mainstream, in special schools, in alternative placements and home educated, and it is a spectrum. So I think it's always important to start with the needs of each individual learner and looking at what meets their needs. I think the reason, though, why home education is something, parents do look to is because there are still challenges around that awareness and understanding of PDA. Some schools absolutely get it and, really understand, but there are also some schools who don't yet have that awareness of PDA or might be struggling to see how to apply that. And then for those PDA learners, that can be really tough to be in an environment where they're not understood. And that's why we're so committed at the PDA Society to try and improve in that awareness and understanding so that people have that choice. And I think that's the thing that it does make me a bit angry sometimes, is I hate it when families have that choice taken away from them. So elective home education, some families can do that, some can't for financial reasons, even if they might like to. And there are some families who actually want their child to be in school and can't, and they've applied to every school they can, and each school say no, and no one should have that choice taken away from them. So that's something I think we really need to see changed.
Yeah, it sort of leads me on to one of my next questions, which was, so where can they get this information then? So there'll be teachers, Senkos, etc., listening to this and thinking, right, hopefully they need to learn more about PDA to support their learners better. I know I've read a few books and I've watched a few webinars on your website. Are they good starting points? The webinars are brilliant, by the way, and your videos are fantastic. Where should people go? Where are we sending them?
There's so many places. I mean, as the CEO of the PDA Society, I'd be like,
you're going to say that?
I may be a little biased. We have on there a home educators site. We have a page dedicated to teachers. So we do have those resources. And we also signpost to a lot of other resources as well. And I think the fabulous thing is there's a real, richness of resources from PDA young people, from PDA adults. And I think what better to learn from people who are living and breathing this themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so and there's other organisations who are supporting PDA people too. So I'd say, you might want to start with our website, but on there we list as many of the resources as possible that other people have in addition to our own.
Brilliant. How can they find your website then? What's the link? I'll put it in the thing as well, but some people like to listen.
Yeah. So it's PDA Society, and Jilly, have I got this right? .org.uk. I'm pretty certain that's it. I have a moment of questioning myself. So we're the only UK registered charity, exclusively dedicated to supporting the PDA community. So I hope if people visit our website, that will be a helpful starting point.
Yeah, and you're on social media as well. I think I follow you on Twitter now.
Yeah, so we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube as well. So
wow, you're on all of them now.
I know. So on most social media platforms. And we have an inquiry line. So that can be accessed through our website, and that's accessible to both PDA adults, to also parents and to professionals. And we aim to get back to people within 3 to 5 working days. And that's a free service, and you can access both emotional support and also practical guidance as well. And the people answering those queries are all people with lived experience.
Wow, that's brilliant. Really, really useful. Oh, thank you so much. I've learned so much. I've been really looking forward to recording this because it is something I find really interesting, and I really hope it helps, shine a bit more of a light on it. I know you're doing wonderful work yourselves to raise awareness, but I hope this helps a little bit as well. So thank you ever so much for joining me. And
thank you so much. I mean, we're thrilled to be partners with Twinkle and to have this opportunity to come and to speak with you today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jillian.
Such an interesting and important topic. Do head over to the PDA Society's website for more information. Thanks again for listening to Send in the Experts with me, Georgina Durrant.